Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Just a quick reminder before we get started that you can support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up either A Popular History of Unpopular Things or APHOUT, APHOUT, and you can also now watch episodes on YouTube. So go subscribe to my YouTube channel there. Links for both the Patreon and the YouTube are in the description. Now, for those of you who love exploration stories gone horribly, horribly wrong, you are in for a treat today because we're going to take a look at 3 different expedition parties in the early 20th century, that's the 1900s, and their attempts at exploring Antarctica, the world's highest, driest, windiest, coldest, and iciest continent. That's a lot of superlatives. And in each of today's 3 cases, the explorers experienced extreme hardships, suffering, pain, loss, unimaginable situations where they had to do unthinkable things to survive, and of course, they had to suffer through the bitterly cold temperatures of the coldest places on Earth. From racing to the South Pole to mapping out the continent, these men risked it all to do what they loved most: exploring the unexplored, being true adventurers. And in fact, this period of exploration in the late 1800s, early 1900s is known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. So, we're going to take a look at 3 heroic groups in particular, and we're going to do it chronologically. First, we have the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and his party, which was the first to reach the South Pole. Then, concurrently, we have English explorer Robert Falcon Scott and his party, who were racing against Amundsen. Their story is fraught with tragedy and death and has become a very famous tale of the dangers of Antarctic exploration. And then finally, we'll look at Australian explorer Douglas Mawson, the first to reach the magnetic South Pole and the first to hike up Mount Erebus in 1909. And if the name Erebus sounds familiar, good. It should. It was named after a very famous English ship that sailed for Antarctica under James Clark Ross in 1840 alongside the HMS Terror. And then both the Erebus and Terror sailed for the Arctic in the north, right? Looking for the Northwest Passage through Canada's waterways, where their captains, Francis Crozier and John Franklin, got stuck in pack ice. And it didn't end up so well for anyone on board, right? I did an episode on that one, The Lost Franklin Expedition. It was also popularized by an AMC series called The Terror back in 2018. So I highly recommend watching that, by the way. It's brilliant TV. But anyway, Mawson was the first to hike up Mount Erebus in Antarctica and get to the magnetic South Pole, right? Like I said. But when he returned to map out the continent in 1911, his expedition went horribly wrong. So we have a lot to talk about today. And in my opinion, it's really gripping stuff. There are adventures on par with the earliest Mount Everest mountaineers, or men who froze to death in the icy expanses of the Northwest Passage, not just Franklin, but all the other ones who went before and after him. These are the stories of men who risked it all to explore the harshest places on our planet. And as always, we're going to start with a brief historical context. Essentially, why then and why there? Why 1911, 1912 in Antarctica? What was going on in the world that explains why these explorers wanted to go to that place? Then, after we have a better understanding of the why, we'll go through each of the 3 stories to get a good sense of why this age of Antarctic exploration was so heroic and why it's a fitting topic for the F Out podcast. So let's get started. Now, the years I'm primarily focusing on today are 1911 to 1914. So if you're a history person, you might think that I'm going to contextualize this alongside World War I. But nope, not this time. We need to go further back, actually, to understand why there were so many expeditions to Antarctica. We also need to consider the explorations of the Arctic in the north in the previous century, like the aforementioned Franklin expedition, one of my favorites. So, as I like to do, let's take a step backwards and look at the bigger picture. We're going back to the British Empire. Now, empires still existed in this pre World War I world. And in fact, many European colonies throughout Africa and Asia fought in World War I for their colonial overlords, not just the British, but a lot of the European colonial overlords. But it's not necessarily the conquering aspect of empire that drove European nations to seek out these discoveries at the poles. A lot of the why exists in both competition and in scientific advancement. In 1830, the Royal Geographical Society was formed in England, and its main goal was to explore land and sea, partly for the adventurer's thrill of discovering undiscovered lands, but also to map out the world and determine which places were ripe for conquering. Take David Livingstone and his explorations into the heart of Africa in 1840. Sure, if you know anything about him, he was primarily there on a missionary expedition. But his explorations and stories encouraged other explorers and hungry imperial nations to sit up and take notice of what Africa had to offer. Man, I really need to get around to that episode on imperialism in Africa. It's coming, I promise. It's going to be a good one. Anyways, the Royal Geographic Society, which I'm just going to call RGS, the RGS sent explorers all around the world. But they were more than just explorers, they were scientists, geographers, researchers, military men. And we can actually go back even further than the formation of the RGS if you think about James Cook and his explorations throughout the Pacific in the mid to late 18th century. That's the 1700s. He was going out there claiming lands for Britain, right? It was about taking those lands, but it was also about mapping out our world. It was supremacy in all realms: political control, religious conversion, economic domination, and scientific advancement. And then once they had those, we also see cultural and social supremacy spreading throughout the British Empire. Now, in the mid 19th century, that's the 1800s, we know that Britain was keen on finding the Northwest Passage. I mean, to be fair, they had been looking for it since the 1400s, ever since Columbus introduced the New World into the European consciousness. But by the mid 1800s, they had narrowed the location of the passage down to icy waterways cutting through Canada, and the British were so focused on getting that done. John Franklin and his crew of 128 men all died, and I mean all of them. They all died in pursuit of it, along with other crews on other expeditions, like I said, both before and after. And many of these men, Franklin included, had done Arctic and Antarctic explorations before, so they had experience with the challenges, right? So, when the first successful trip through the Northwest Passage was done by a Norwegian in 1906, a man we'll talk about soon, Roald Amundsen, actually, the British were incensed. They had expended a lot of time, money, resources, human lives, frankly, into navigating through the passage, and they weren't even the ones to do it completely. They were beaten by a rival. The British felt similarly about Antarctica. After all, it was Captain James Cook who is credited with being the first to sail into Antarctic waters in 1773. And in 1839, James Clark Ross is sent down there with the HMS Terror and Erebus to explore further into the Antarctic Circle, to take note of the magnetic changes as they got closer to the magnetic South Pole. And you know what, actually, this is a good time to talk about the difference between the geographic South Pole and the magnetic South Pole. The geographic South Pole doesn't move. It's at 90 degrees south, right? The bottom of the globe, if you will. It's where all the lines of longitude, also called meridians, the ones that run up and down, it's where they all converge in the south, 90 degrees south. It's a fixed point in Antarctica. And sure, okay, maybe tectonic plates might shift the land around underneath it, but the point itself stays the same. It's the bottom, okay? The magnetic poles do move, though, which is actually pretty cool to think about. I'm going to simplify the science a bit so my listeners can get the visual, but if you're watching on YouTube, you're looking at the visuals. As you may already know, there is a magnetic field that cuts through our planet. Currently, it goes in near the North Pole and comes out near the South Pole, right? In the north and out near the south. And I say currently because on average, every 300,000 years or so, according to NASA, it can flip. How cool is that? But apparently, the last time it flipped was 780,000 years ago. And that doesn't mean that we're due for one. Like, it's not like a volcano that's supposed to erupt and it hasn't yet. It's not that we're due for one. The $300,000 is an average when looking back over hundreds of millions of years of geological history and data points. Big stretches of time. Okay, so it's anyway, let me move on. Now, the magnetic field cutting through our planet is caused by molten iron and nickel, right, metals, in the Earth's core. These liquid metals generate an electric field. But you can imagine, based on how everything is just sloshing around and moving, the magnetic field is always moving as well. Or you might hear the term in flux. The magnetic field is in flux. NASA simplifies it well enough. Quote, since the forces that generate our magnetic field are constantly changing, this field itself is also in continual flux, its strength waxing and waning over time. This causes the location of Earth's magnetic north and south poles to gradually shift. End quote. So, in 1839, James Clerk Ross was sent down to explore the southern magnetic pole, which is fitting because he was actually the first explorer to find the northern magnetic pole in 1831. So that's cool. Which also, as we've just learned, has since moved, right? It was discovered in 1831 northern Canada, but it's kind of shifting across the Arctic towards Russia at this point. Anywho, Ross did not find the southern pole, the magnetic southern pole, or the geographic one for that matter, but he did report back some pretty cool findings about Antarctica. Here are some of the excerpts from his journal. At 78 degrees south, he saw, quote, a perpendicular cliff of ice between 150 and 200 feet above the level of the sea, perfectly flat and level on top, and without any fissures or promontories on even its seaward side. We had discovered a land of so extensive a coastline and attaining such an altitude as to justify the appellation of a great new southern continent. End quote. So basically, the land is so big it's a different continent. It's not just a series of islands, right? And while Ross didn't actually set foot on Antarctica, it left a mark on the British to be the ones to conquer these harsh, desolate places. Ross himself wrote, quote, impressed with the feeling that England had ever led the way of discovery in the southern as well as in the northern regions, I considered it would have been inconsistent with the preeminence she had ever maintained if we were to follow in the footsteps in the expeditions of another nation. So, in short, since Britain generally leads the pack in terms of exploration, British explorers should be the ones to fully conquer the unknown. Now, after this Ross Antarctic expedition, the RGS started sending its men into the cold reaches of the world, north and south, to do that conquering. They did a lot of the work finding the route through the Northwest Passage, right? Only for the full thing to be conquered by the Norwegian Roald Amundsen. The British did a lot of work exploring and taking measurements in Antarctica, too. So now that it was about the right time to start pushing towards the geographic South Pole and check that one off the list, the British wanted to be the ones who did it. They were motivated by the same things that led to imperialism: competition and dominance. Maybe not as heavy in the political realm, but certainly in the scientific one. They wanted to be the ones who discovered all the things and got all of the glory. So, how irritating for them that they weren't the ones to get to the geographic South Pole first. That distinction, again, went to Roald Amundsen. So, to start with Roald, a disclaimer. Though there were certainly other expeditions to try to reach the South Pole before Amundsen, like the Irish Anglo explorer Ernest Shackleton, who, by the way, got 97 miles away from the pole between 1907 and 1909, pretty close. I'm going to start my story with Roald, with the first successful attempt, because otherwise we'll be here forever. And as you can tell by looking at the minute count on this episode, it's already going to be a long one. So I don't need to add in any more stories. Now, Amundsen's first trip to Antarctica was in 1899 as a second officer on board the Belgica. The point of this expedition was to reach the magnetic South Pole, but it wasn't successful in that regard. It was the first expedition as part of this heroic age of Antarctic exploration, and it was also the first exploration to spend the winter in the Antarctic. Even though that wasn't actually their plan, but their ship got stuck in pack ice anyway. The idea was to go during the Southern Hemisphere's summer months, but they got waylaid. The problem was that they just weren't kit out for winter. Now, Lynne Cox, who is an adventurer, a swimmer, and a writer, puts it well in her book, South with the Sun, Roald Amundsen, His Polar Explorations, and the Quest for Discovery. Quote, they were unprepared for the winter, lacking the clothes, equipment, or supplies to sustain the entire crew through an Antarctic winter as they drifted around uncharted polar seas. End quote. Amundsen learned a lot from this trip, even though it didn't go as planned. He learned to eat raw penguin and seal meat when possible to prevent scurvy. And in general, to eat fresh meat to prevent scurvy. He learned that you have to get a little bit creative when stuck in an ice pack for months on end. And he learned that he had to be prepared for an Antarctic winter. If anything, over-prepare for it. Now, he honed his winter adventuring skills even further in 1903 when he led his own expedition to sail through the Northwest Passage. Amundsen was fascinated by polar expeditions, including the Franklin expedition, where the men aboard the Terror and Erebus got stuck in the ice and eventually died off King William Island, right? Go listen to my episode on that one if you're interested in the whole story. It's pretty neat. But the Franklin expedition fueled his lifelong dream to sail the Northwest Passage. So he and his crew planned to be the first to successfully do it. On a small-ish boat, only like 6 men on it, from the Atlantic side to the Pacific side. And as we know, he did. Now, on this trip, Amundsen went to some of the same places where Franklin and his men had touched ground, which is pretty cool. Again, he's one of his childhood heroes, right? So he wanted to follow in his footsteps. But more importantly, for our story about Antarctica and the South Pole, it was on this trip, sailing the Northwest Passage, that Amundsen learned a lot from the local Inuit people about how to survive in the Arctic, but more generally in the polar freezing regions. Things like using sled dogs, Eskimo dogs, right, to transport stuff around, or how to build a proper igloo, or wearing animal skins instead of wool coats to keep warm and, more relevant, to keep dry when wet. The animal skins are a lot better at wicking away the water. The wool will soak it in eventually. Now, invigorated, he planned his next expedition to be the first man to reach the North Pole, because that's what he's already used to. But then it came out that 2 men already claimed to be the first. Dr. Frederick Cook, who was on board the Belgica with Amundsen, actually in 1899, so they knew each other, he claimed that he reached the North Pole in mid-April of 1908. But then right after that, a man named Robert Peary claimed that he was actually at the North Pole 2 weeks prior to Cook. It was a big controversy, actually, and neither could actually conclusively prove that they were there. But regardless, Amundsen didn't want to be messed up with that. He wanted to be the first, and he wasn't the first, or at least it was called into question. So he changed his plan once he had already left. If the North Pole was taken, then he'd be the first to reach the South Pole. But at the same time, British explorer Robert Falcon Scott was already on an expedition to be the first to get to the South Pole. So it was now a race. And spoiler, and you could have assumed this anyway because I told you we were doing this episode chronologically, but Amundsen and his crew reached it first. Scott got there about a little bit more than a month later, but we'll discuss his story next. Both Amundsen and Scott started their trips from the Ross Ice Shelf. From there, they would have to cross a vast expanse of ice, climb up and onto the glaciers, navigate around and over the trans-Antarctic mountains, and then head for the pole. Amundsen's big thing was making sure that he had a crew of Eskimo dogs, which he actually brought with him from Greenland. They would pull extra food, which he figured was the key to survival. And based on his previous experiences, and from what he learned from other people's failed expeditions to find the South Pole, like Shackleton a couple of years prior, he knew that bringing enough food was a crucial part of surviving in the cold, right? It would tire the men to carry it themselves the whole way. Another choice that used to be used were ponies, but ponies weren't suited for the icy terrain. But sled dogs, absolutely perfect for the job. The unfortunate part, though, is that having a bunch of dogs with you meant that they also became part of the food supply. If they were injured or couldn't pull the sled anymore or died, or if any other food provisions ran out, they would be killed and eaten. Poor babies. Now, Amundsen brought 97 dogs with him, but some of them had puppies on the way, so they arrived in Antarctica with 110 dogs. That is a lot, sweet baby doggos. That's a lot of puppies. I need to not get attached. I know what happens here. I need to not get attached with these dogs. It does not end up well for almost all of them. Steel yourself, dog lovers. It's not going to be pretty. Now, the expedition, Amundsen's expedition, was split in two. We have a land party headed by Amundsen that they would go for the South Pole, and then we have a sea party. They're going to get data, break some other southern sailing records while they're at it, right? And then they're going to meet up with Amundsen at an established later date for pickup when he was successful. That was the plan. Now, Amundsen, on the way to the South Pole, set up extra caches of food for the way back, which is a really smart move. Why bring all of your food with you to the pole and then all of it back, right? Set some up along the way. It gives you something to look forward to. It gives you some markers to look at on the way back, and it helps you ration your food. Very smart move. Lightens the load, too. Makes it easier for the dogs to travel faster. They would store things like seal meat. Raw seal meat, by the way. Blubber. Dried fish, chocolate, biscuits, margarine, basically things with a lot of energy that would also survive in freezing temperatures. Because there's nothing like cold, raw fat to get you excited for adventuring. Delicious. Now, they experienced some problems, of course. Their compasses didn't work after a while. It's pretty darn cold down there, so they had to chart using the stars, which is awesome. There was also dense fogs that came and went, intense winds and blizzards, vast expanses of nothing but flat white snow and a white environment around it. So there weren't a lot of landmarks to help guide them. That's part of the reason why they built those snow cairns, these little caches, right? They would do sled runs ahead of time to mark out the route, which helps with little flags, acclimatizing themselves while they're at it, and the dogs, because the dogs have been on a ship for a long time, so the dogs needed time to, sort themselves out and make sure they were ready. It's all about that preparation. What does my husband always tell me? Prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. He says it's a British Navy thing that he picked up when he served back in the 90s, but it also might be an Army thing. I don't know. It's an English thing. Prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. The 6 Ps. Now, some other problems that they encountered. The dogs, the 110 they had with them, and some of them were puppies, by the way. Super cute. They were constantly fighting with each other, so that's not helpful. They were also freezing, the dogs and the people, constantly shivering, so that's a problem. Because the temperature in September 1911 dropped as low as minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 55 Celsius for my non-Americans, though it's not like any of us can even contemplate or fathom how cold that is, so giving you the Celsius doesn't really help much. But anyway, it was so cold, by the way, so cold that one of the men in Amundsen's crew felt a chunk of his frostbitten heel fall off his foot inside his sock. Gross. Now, on their proper start to the pole, not just running the dogs, not just laying supply chains, right? On the actual start to the pole, they would set up 6-foot-high beacons, like I mentioned, with flags and stuff, to make landmarks for the way back, because the environment was just white and flat, so you can get lost really easily. They shot and ate their dogs as necessary when they couldn't keep up, because slowing down or stopping could mean death for everyone, the dogs included. But it wasn't just when the dogs were slow, like I mentioned. They planned to systematically kill off the dogs to make sure that they had food, which makes me really sad. I said I wouldn't get attached. Guys, I'm attached. I feel bad for these dogs. Now, on November 15th, they were at a latitude of 85 degrees south. And of course, they're trying to get to 90, right? The southern point. And ahead of them was a mountain range. With them still, they had 42 dogs at that point and enough food and equipment for 30 days. The plan was to continue killing and eating the dogs so that there would only be 12 left at the end, enough to bring them back home to camp. And on the way back, of course, they already had supply depots with food, so hopefully, theoretically, they wouldn't have to keep killing more of their dogs. It was an arduous journey. They dodged avalanches, they climbed several mountains, they reached altitudes of over 10,000 feet. They continued to kill and eat their canine companions as necessary. On December 7th, they were at an altitude of 87 degrees, so we've gone a couple degrees south, only a few degrees away from the pole. But the weather was bad. There were clouds, there was fog, there was dense snow. Luckily, they were able to periodically get a clear line of sight of the sun, so at least they knew the direction, right? And not only did they want to make sure they were heading in the right direction, but they also need to be able to prove that they did in fact make it to the South Pole. They need to get those readings perfectly right, and they needed the position of the sun to do that. Because unlike the argument going on back in the non-frozen world about whether Cook or Pearcey was the first to reach the North Pole, he wanted to conclusively prove that he reached the South Pole first. He wanted to take the data, he needed to prove it, he was going to take a picture. There was going to be no doubt, right, that Amundsen was the first to do this. On December 14th, 1911, Amundsen, his crew, and 17 dogs became the first to reach the South Pole. And yes, I am counting the dogs in this achievement, in this accomplishment, because without them, Amundsen and the rest would not have made it, or at least they would have been a lot more bedraggled once they had arrived. I'm attached to the dogs, okay? I can't help it. Now, when they got there, it took them a couple of days. They camped out for a while to really make sure they had the place. And when they figured out the exact location of the South Pole, the geographic South Pole, they planted the Norwegian flag, named the area after the King of Norway, left some supplies for Scott's crew because it was clear that Amundsen had reached the pole first, and he wanted to make sure that they would survive as well. Now, there's actually a really cool picture of one of Amundsen's expeditionaries, one of the guys with him, standing at the Norwegian flag with the dogs. It's a really grainy black and white picture, but you can see the relief and pride in his face. Go dogs! And Amundsen and his team too, I guess. Good job, puppies. The way back was relatively smooth sailing because they had set up food depots along the way. They had plenty of supplies to keep them going. As Edward Larson writes in his book, An Empire of Ice, Scott, Shackleton, and the Heroic Age of Antarctic Science, quote, rations steadily increased for the men and dogs as they passed their evenly spaced supply depots. We could not manage more, Amundsen said of the food. Some was left behind. The dogs were bursting with health and tugged at their harness. The polar party reached their base after 99 days out and back, and Amundsen had gained weight. End quote. You imagine hiking over mountains and being the first to go over Antarctica to the South Pole, and you're so well prepared that you actually gain weight with all of the food you had supplied? Man. It was January 25th, 1912, 42 days after reaching the pole, that Amundsen returned to camp, apparently with more weight on them than when he left, with his men and 11 dogs remaining. They had gone 1,860 miles in 99 days. And if sailing through the Northwest Passage wasn't enough to prove how awesome he was as an explorer, now he can add being the first to reach the South Pole to that list. But what of Robert Falcon Scott and his expedition? Well, let's take a look at his story. Quick tea break. So we know that Amundsen and Scott ended up racing for the pole. And we know that Amundsen won that race, and though I mentioned a few setbacks and hurdles, it generally went kind of okay, right? Relatively, in terms of an Antarctic expedition in the early 1900s anyway. But that is not the case for Scott's attempt that same year, the Terra Nova expedition, named after the ship they went down there on. But 1911 wasn't actually Scott's first time to the Antarctic. He led the Discovery expedition, also named after his ship, in 1901 to 1904. Scott and two others in the expedition party, which included the famous explorer Ernest Shackleton, set a record in 1902 when they reached 82 degrees south, which was the furthest south anyone had been at that point. They crossed 500 miles on foot, carried heavy sledges with their gear and their food, but they had to turn back because the trek was just too difficult with what they had on them, and they were about 530 miles away from the pole at that point. But in the Discovery expedition, Scott learned about the difficulties of Antarctic exploration. He knew the dangers. He had been there. He had brought dogs along with him and killed them when needed. He understood the necessity of having fresh food, as his crew also battled with scurvy. And though they didn't reach the pole, they had amassed a good deal of scientific knowledge to bring back home with them. He returned a hero, was promoted a couple of times, and started rubbing elbows with the rich and powerful in Britain. But he always wanted to go back. So, 5 years later, in 1909, when Scott was presented with the opportunity, he set sail on the Terra Nova to try again at reaching the pole. The RGS wanted this to be more of a scientific exploration and expedition, but Scott was clear in his main objective, which was, and I quote, to reach the South Pole and to secure for the British Empire the honor of this achievement. End quote. And this jives pretty well with what I was saying earlier about the remnants of imperialism. And at this point, let's be honest, it's just British nationalism, right? To reach the pole would be a huge personal victory, but it would also be a good victory for the British Empire, especially considering the context. Other big wins had been won by non-Brits lately, right? Like Amundsen navigating through the Northwest Passage. And also, the two men that claimed the North Pole were both Americans. So, it's time for the Brits to get a win. Because, they haven't had lots of them already. Oh, and by the way, the first undisputed, verifiable visit to the North Pole, right? Because the other two guys, it wasn't sure. So the first one who, undisputably got there was, you want to guess? Roald Amundsen, again, but this time in 1926, in an airship. He sailed to it, right? Which gives us a good insight, actually, into the preferred technologies of the day. No more sailing in ships. Let's just fly. Post-World War I, we're flying now. So anyways, Scott set sail on the Terra Nova in June 1910. Amundsen didn't leave until 3 months later, but he actually arrived in Antarctica first, and as we now know, reached the pole first as well. I can only imagine how irritated Scott must have felt to potentially have this prize taken away from him and Britain once again. When Scott planned and left for his expedition, it was not a race. So Scott wasn't kit out for speed and efficiency. He was set up for a scientific expedition, and he would also reach the South Pole while he was there, okay? His ship had 66 men on board, 34 of whom would actually go on shore in Antarctica. Amundsen, in comparison, had 19 men on board, only 9 of whom would winter in Antarctica. Remember, the rest were going to stay on board, take some measurements, and meet them later, right? So Scott and his bigger party set his base on Ross Island, about 700 miles away in a straight line from the pole. It's the route that Shackleton had taken before. It was the known route, it's the one the Brits liked to use at the time. Amundsen, knowing this, set up on the other side of the Ross ice shelf, about 60 to 80 miles closer to the pole, actually. And if it wasn't clear that this was absolutely a race and not just coincidental timing on Amundsen's part, Amundsen wrote that, quote, the plan was to leave the station as early in the spring as possible, the station they set up on the ice. If we had set out to capture this record, we must get, at any cost, we must get there first, end quote. Scott was not set up for a race. He had more men. He had a longer and more difficult path. He didn't have close to 100 dogs that would carry his supplies and food. Well, more than that by the time they arrived. In fact, Scott relied pretty heavily on ponies and their own muscles, manpower, to haul gear in sledges, as well as some rudimentary motorized sledges that he brought along with him, a relatively new invention at the time. He did have a few dozen Siberian dogs, but it just wasn't enough compared to the 110 that Amundsen arrived with. And don't forget that Scott was also there to get measurements and further the RGS's scientific knowledge, not just to race to the pole. What I'm trying to say is, what I'm trying to set up and make abundantly clear, it was never going to be Scott. He arrived second. He had a greater distance to travel. He had more men and gear to contend with. He wasn't kit out for a race, and he had other expectations for his time. Amundsen knew what Scott had going on, set himself up to just race to that pole, and he did. It wasn't a level playing field, right? So then let's hone in on Scott's expedition to the pole. Because of the 34 men who disembarked, only 5 were in the final party that actually reached it. And none of them made it back alive. Scott and the others arrived in Antarctica in January of 1911. He didn't unload and immediately head to the pole, and neither did Amundsen for that matter. It's not like they just jumped off the boats and started sled dogging their way at top speed into the continent, right? There was a considerable amount of setting up, planning, and prep to do. First order of business was building a shelter. They called it the Terra Nova hut. But it wasn't a tiny, cramped hut. It was 50 feet long, 25 feet wide, 9 feet high. I mean, a decently sized building. At the time, it was the biggest in Antarctica. I think it only took them 8 days to put up, too, which is pretty impressive. Now, once that was situated, because some men would be staying behind at the hut to carry out some measurements and do sciencey stuff, Scott and 15 men would continue on that journey to the pole. There would be 3 groups. One main group that would reach the pole, and then 2 support groups that would travel ahead and make supply depots along the way to help that main group, with Scott in it, of course, reach the destination. Now, Scott hadn't decided who was going to be in that final group with him. He was going to make up his mind last minute about who would join him. I guess it depended on how well the men were doing, how physically fit they were, how mentally tough they were doing, stuff like that. The first support group left in late October 1911 and had some difficulties right off the bat. In addition to a handful of dogs and ponies, Scott had those motor-powered sledges I mentioned, right? But after about 50 miles, the motor sledges they had with them broke down, so the first support group had to travel on foot for the next 150 miles. They didn't get that far before the others behind them caught up to them, defeating the purpose of leaving earlier to set up some supply depots, so oops. Then, a blizzard hit in early December, forcing the men to stay in their tents for 5 days. This caused them to eat through their rations a little faster than they intended, and the ponies that they had tied up outside were growing weaker by the day, and the cold was just too cold for them. So they were eventually killed and eaten for their meat, which just meant that traveling and pulling the sledges just became significantly harder because your workhorse, literally, I guess, is just been eaten. By December 23rd, so almost Christmas, about half of the 15 men were sent back to camp, the Terra Nova hut, with instructions to meet up later with some more dogs to help not really the victors, but help those who made it to the pole get back safely. They would need that help, right? But we're not really sure what happened here because the dogs never arrived. The men did return to camp, though. Maybe they forgot. Maybe there was some weird conspiracy going on. I don't know. There is a lot of speculation about maybe some guys had it out for Scott, and I'm not going to spread conspiracies because there's nothing concrete. But either way, the dogs never showed up, which probably would have saved their lives. Now, the party continued on until Scott decided on who would go on that final push. And on January 4th, 3 men were told to return to camp. And the 5 that would go to the South Pole were Scott, Edward Wilson, Lawrence Oates, Edgar Evans, and Henry Bowers. I want to mention their names because it's a huge achievement, and also they died, so in honor. Now, these men made that final push to the pole, and they reached it on January 17th, 1912. And they were greeted with Amundsen's green tent, some supplies that he had left behind for Scott and his men, a note welcoming them to 90 degrees south, along with some other letters, and the Norwegian flag. Amundsen had arrived 35 days earlier. Scott was crushed. Upon reaching it, he wrote, quote, "The pole, yes, but under very different circumstances from those expected. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority. Well, it is something to have got here. Now for the run home and a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it." End quote. So the next day, the group turned around to head back. An 883-mile return journey. And it was at this point that things started to go south. Things started to go wrong, okay? Despite supply teams setting up depots and caches to help, the 5 men were suffering from a lack of food, exhaustion, and frostbite. And what was left in the supply depots on the way back wasn't enough. There weren't left enough oil, gasoline to have fires in the tent at night to cook their food, to warm up. At one point, Edgar Evans collapsed and injured himself while the group was descending down what was called the Beardmore Glacier from the Trans-Antarctic Mountains to the Ross Ice Shelf. Right, so there's a glacier that they climbed up. On the way down, he fell and hurt himself. He succumbed to his injuries and died on February 17th. Once out on the Ross Ice Shelf, heading back towards their base camp, the weather worsened. The team was stuck in a blizzard, and they had to wait it out in their tent. One of the other men, Oates, was so sickly by this point that he wished that he would die in the night. That's what he said. He wished he would die overnight. He woke up the next morning, still alive. He tried to persuade Scott to leave him behind since he felt like he was holding the team back, but Scott, of course, refused. You're not going to leave a man behind. So, when Oates woke up, March 15th, he walked out of the tent in the full force of the blizzard. And his last words were, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." He sacrificed himself for the sake of the group. He felt he was at his end, and he didn't want to impede the group any further, and he didn't want to make use of any more of the quickly diminishing pile of food that they had left. Scott wrote about it in his journal, quote, "We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death, but though we tried to dissuade him, we knew that it was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. We all hope to meet the end with a similar spirit, and assuredly the end is not far." End quote. The remaining 3 men carried on, but the weather was still horrendous, and they were rapidly declining in both health and strength, physical health and mental health. On March 29th, Scott wrote the following in his journal, quote, "Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. R. Scott. For God's sake, look after our people." These were the last words that Scott wrote in his journal. He died shortly after, alongside Wilson and Bowers in their tent. Their frozen corpses were found later that year, on November 12th, only 11 miles away from the next depot that might have saved their lives. And all 5 of these men's bodies are still buried in Antarctica. The Norwegian Amundsen, who had changed his plans last minute and raced to the pole, had survived. The English Scott, who had been a stalwart in British Antarctic expeditions, had died. And it was unfortunate for Amundsen that Scott didn't make it back, because for a lot of the press, particularly the British press, Amundsen was blamed for Scott's death. The idea being that the competition is what killed Scott, forcing him to race to the pole when he hadn't planned to do so. Amundsen argued that he was just better prepared, with his food, supplies, and dogs, and polar survival skills accumulated over the past 10 or so years. Scott had polar experience too, but his mission was different, and he didn't have almost 100 trained dogs with him to help speed things up. Instead, Scott tried to rely on machines that broke, right? Ponies that were ill suited for the environment and terrain, and good old fashioned man powered sledges, which honestly should have just remained a relic from the earlier days of British naval exploration. And add to that some bad luck with the blizzard conditions on the Ross Ice Shelf, not enough food in the supply caches, or because of the weather, he was unable to get to the ones that were there, and it just didn't pan out for Scott and his men. But the South Pole was won. We can check that one off the explorer list, right? But despite that, others still wanted to get to Antarctica. And one of those men was Douglas Mawson, an Australian who had previous experience there with Shackleton, who was credited with being the first to summit Mount Erebus and the first to reach the magnetic South Pole. He also turned down a spot on Scott's fatal expedition to the pole to lead his own expedition, the Australasian Antarctic Expedition. And despite the death and despair associated with Scott's famous story, his attempt to be the first to the pole, I actually think Mawson's story is potentially even more horrific and awe-inspiring. So as I previously mentioned, Mawson was no stranger to Antarctica. In this heroic age of exploration, he wanted his own piece of the glory. He wasn't trying to reach the geographic South Pole, though, that was already done. He wanted to explore the virtually unknown parts of Antarctica south of Australia. It was known as King George V Land and Adélie Land. Like with Scott's expedition, he also set out to do some geographical and scientific studies, including, hopefully, a trip to the magnetic South Pole to take some more readings. Since we know that it moves, they like to take readings periodically. Anyway, he left Australia in December of 1911, and to put that in chronological context for you, that was the same month that Amundsen made history by being the first to reach the South Pole. Okay, that's when he leaves. Like with the previous explorers, he put together several teams of men who would do different tasks. He was in what he called the Far Eastern Party, and alongside Xavier Mertz and Belgrave Ninnis, his plan was to explore at least 350 miles of Antarctica, mapping out lands that nobody else had even seen before, connecting his Australia adjacent chunk of Antarctica with the area explored and seen by Amundsen and Scott earlier that year and the year prior. So, if you look at a traditional map of Antarctica, with the South Pole in the middle, right, and the Ross Ice Shelf below that, Mawson set out to explore what you would see as the southeastern chunk. They set up camp at Cape Denison's, what they called it, and planned to explore west across the coastline, connecting it to those already mapped out areas on the Ross Ice Shelf explored by the previous guys. But since I'm talking about it in my AF-Out episode, you know it's not going to go super well. The guy and his explorations were cool and important anyway, so I like talking about them, but there's a reason I picked this one in particular. And of the different groups and parties associated with the Australasian Antarctic exploration, I'm just going to focus on this one led by Mawson, Mertz, and Ninnis. So, by the time Mawson began his expedition, it was clear that Amundsen saw success with his dogs. In fact, small side tangent here. Remember how the British were not super happy with Amundsen because he got to the pole first and their man, Scott, died? Well, at an Argius banquet in 1912 honoring Amundsen and his accomplishment, one man gave a speech that ended like this, quote, "I almost wish that in our tribute of admiration, we can include those wonderful, good-tempered, fascinating dogs, the true friends of man, without whom Captain Amundsen would never have got to the pole. I therefore propose 3 cheers for the dogs." End quote. Yikes. That's a pretty big dig at Amundsen. It belittles his accomplishments, and instead of, I don't know, it just, let's cheer on the dogs instead of Amundsen. And to be fair, the dogs did help him speedrun to the pole. But yikes. So Mawson would have known about how helpful the dogs were anyway, so he brought some as well. But unfortunately for Mawson, a bunch of them died on the trip over from Australia. So when Mawson, Mertz, and Ninnis left their camp for the portion of their expedition in late 1912, because again, they have to get there, build a base, winter, right, get ready for it. So they left for their expedition in late 1912. They only had 17 dogs to help them pull 3 sledges, totaling 1,723 pounds. And most of that was food for both the men and the dogs. The men faced weather issues similar to Scott and his party. Terrible storms and blizzards that forced them to stay in their tent for days, horribly strong winds that sometimes reached up to 80 miles per hour. It was brutal. At one point, Ninnis walked around for too long without his rudimentary snow goggles, so he got snow blindness. And it's been a while since that's come up in an episode, but the short of it is that it's bad when the sun's rays bounce off the white snow and go straight into your eyes. Okay, if you don't wear the proper eyewear when you're out on the snow, you could become temporarily or sometimes permanently blind from the UV rays attacking your eyeballs. Now, back in the early 20th century, snow goggles weren't those fancy rainbow-colored ones that you see out at ski resorts and on the slopes. They were goggles with smoky lenses to help keep out the light, or I even saw a pair that Scott used in his first expedition, the 1901 to 1904 one. They were wooden goggles with little crosses cut out over the eyes. So basically, you can't see except for the wooden cross, which limits, I guess, the amount of UV light and exposure that you're getting. I can't think that was super effective, though. You can't really see much, and what you can see out of will still blind you. But anyways, Ninnis had to deal with snow blindness for a while. Mawson tried to help him with a common treatment they used to use back then, which was opening up the eyelids and putting in a tablet of zinc sulfate and cocaine hydrochloride, and then letting your tears naturally dissolve those tablets under your eyelid. Okay, first, ouch, I don't want to put anything on my eyeballs, thank you. And second, yes, cocaine is in the drug. Cocaine hydrochloride is powdered cocaine that at the time was used as an anesthetic. Please don't stick cocaine in your eyeballs. It's going to be a bad time. But it wasn't just the weather and the snow blindness that they had to contend with. Mawson, Mertz, and Ninnis were constantly running into crevasses, cutting deep into the glaciers. Not a crevice, which is a narrow split in a rock or a wall. It's similar, though, similar concept. A crevasse is essentially a super deep crack in glacial ice, which can appear from stress on the glacier, or when the glacier moves, or if the glacier is moving and hits a bump on the ground and it cracks it. They can be hundreds of feet deep and also pretty wide depending on how it formed. Certainly enough to swallow, say, a sledge. They're relatively common, actually, and it can happen even on Antarctic land, not just glaciers, because of all the snow and the ice. If there's deep snow and ice, a crevasse can develop. So basically, most of Antarctica. And Mawson and his team had many run-ins with crevasses. On November 20th, Mawson wrote in his journal about their first encounter with one, quote, "Suddenly, without any warning, the leading dogs of my team dropped out of sight, swinging in their harness ropes in a crevasse. The next moment, I realized that the sledges were on a bridge covering a crevasse, 25 feet wide, the dogs having broken through on one edge. We spent some anxious moments before they were hauled to the daylight and the sledges rested on solid ground." End quote. The next day, Ninnis fell through a thin layer of ice and snow covering up a crevasse and was hanging on to the edge. Luckily, the men rescued him in time. And in his journal, Mawson wrote that he investigated the fissure and found naught but black space below, a close shave for Ninnis. But that wasn't even their scariest incident. On December 14th, Ninnis, his dogs, and his sledge had broken through yet another thin lid of ice covering a crevasse. But this time, he fell straight into the crack. There 1 second, gone the next. Mawson wrote that, quote, "We broke back the edge of the hard snow lid and, secured by a rope, took turns leaning over, calling into the darkness in the hope that our companion might still be alive. For 3 hours, we called unceasingly, but no answering sound came back. A chill draft rose out of the abyss. We felt that there was no hope." End quote. They surveyed the depths of the crevasse, hoping that they could go down to explore, try to find Ninnis, but it was far too deep. They spotted one dead and one injured dog around 150-ish feet down on a little ledge, but nothing else. Ninnis and the sledge must have been even deeper, and he was likely dead on impact when he fell. And if he wasn't dead on impact when he fell, they wouldn't be able to go down there and rescue him anyway. Ninnis was gone. So they held a funeral service next to the crevasse, packed up, and turned back. It was the end of their push to connect the coasts and lands below Australia with those that Scott and Amundsen explored. The loss of their friend and companion was bad enough, but Ninnis had also had a fair amount of food and supplies on that sledge, not to mention the dogs that fell in with him. Ninnis' sledge had nearly all of the men's food, all of the dogs' food, their tent, some tools, and some other pieces of gear. They still had a stove, sleeping bags, and fuel, but no proper shelter. They had to MacGyver one out of what they had left. They also lost extra clothes needed to stay warm and dry, so that was a disaster. It wasn't looking good for Mawson and Mertz, is my point, and they were 5 weeks away from their base with only a week and a half's worth of rations. The trip back was difficult. The dogs, without proper access to food, were starving, and as they started to weaken and slow down, they were killed and consumed for energy, but it wasn't really enough to keep the other dogs or the men fully fed. So after a while, Mawson and Mertz had to help pull the sledges, but they were exhausted too. And as they carried on, their stuff got soggier and wetter. And without the extra layers and gear, the ones that went into the crevasse with Ninnis, both Mawson and Mertz were getting colder and colder. On December 28th, the last dog died. The men camped and cooked her, using her skull as a dish that they would pass back and forth, eating and drinking their food, not because they had lost their minds, but because they really didn't have anything else. They were leaving all of their excess gear behind to help lighten the load. But now that the last dog was gone, they would have to walk themselves out alone, and without any more emergency sources of food. It was Mertz that got sick first. His last entry was on January 1st, 1913. At that point, he no longer had the strength to write. He was quickly declining. Any energy was spent hauling sledges and walking back to camp. He was having a hard time digesting the dog meat, and what little food supplies they had left weren't enough to maintain his fragile health. Soon enough, Mertz couldn't even haul the sledge anymore, so after some insistence from Mawson, he actually got in the sledge, and Mawson had to haul Mertz alongside their supplies. What a badass, by the way, that he still had that kind of strength. But resting didn't help Mertz much anyway. It just made him colder, sitting there and not moving and having the wind blow on him all the time. And his stomach was in so much pain that he couldn't eat anything, really. Mawson wrote in his journal, quote, "Things are in a most serious state for both of us. If he cannot go on 8 or 10 miles in a day, we are doomed. I could pull through myself with provisions at hand, but I cannot leave him. His heart seems to have gone." End quote. Mawson and Mertz were starved, frostbitten, perpetually damp, and were rubbed raw, so they were chafing all over, which, as a woman with thighs, I know it is painful to deal with. Mertz was also starting to lose it. His mind was deteriorating alongside his body. He thrashed around, bit off the tip of his frostbitten finger, and raged for a bit before falling into a coma. And at around 2 a.m. on January 8th, he died. Mawson spent the rest of the night sleeping next to his dead friend, buried him in a sleeping bag under a pile of snow, erected a cross, read a quick burial service for him, and had to carry on alone. It was 26 days after Ninnis had died. In the days after Mawson buried Mertz, he was facing searing winds of up to 50 miles per hour, forcing him to stay put in his tent for even longer. He ran out of dog meat by the 10th. On the 11th, the weather was cooperative, so he was eager to make at least 10 miles. He was on a deadline to get back to his base at Camp Denison before the ship left him there for another winter, so he was eager to get going, right? But as he got started that morning, he noticed that, ready for this? The soles of his feet had completely separated from his foot, and they were just sloshing around in his sock. Gross. But he had to carry on to meet his ship in time, so he just did his best to bandage everything together with more socks and carry on. He managed to limp 6.5 miles that day. On January 16th, he had a scare with his old nemesis, the crevasse. He broke through a layer of thin ice covering one and almost fell to his death, actually, but luckily he managed to stop the sledge from falling in, which would most certainly have brought him down with it. And then the next day, he fell into another crevasse. With a bridge of snow that he was crossing over, it collapsed under the weight. But the sledge got wedged. That's a fun rhyme. It got wedged into the snows on either side of the crevasse, and he was dangling by a rope about 14 feet down from the sledge into the darkness of the crevasse. The walls were 6 feet apart out of his reach, and it's not like he wanted to risk swinging wildly back and forth in case he dislodged the sledge and it fell in, right? So he had to climb his way up the rope. Now, luckily, he had already put knots in it, which helped, but otherwise, I don't think a man who had been through everything that Mawson had been through would be in a fit state to climb a rope dangling into a crevasse and over certain depth. This guy had a serious will to live. Now, he got to the top of the crevasse, but the edge of it broke and he fell back down again, and luckily, the sledge didn't collapse and fall down with him. He dangled there for a while, contemplating whether or not he should just give up and die, but then mustered the strength to try again. And according to his memoir, a verse from the poet Robert Service popped into his head in that moment. Quote, "Just have one more try. It's dead easy to die. It's the keeping on living that's hard." End quote. Very poetic. I'm not sure how believable that is, to be honest. It sounds a bit too storybook for me, but the dude's a badass, so that's fine. Now, he managed to climb out of the crevasse again, immediately passed out once he was safe, and woke up a few hours later covered by a dusting of snow. He then fashioned a rope ladder of sorts and tied it to the sledge and himself, so if this happened again, it would be easier for him to climb out. And it's a good thing he did this, because he did fall into a few more crevasses on his way out. At least, he said he did in his memoirs later on. They weren't mentioned in his journal, so who knows. Now, he kept going, making slow but steady progress. On January 29th, he came across a supply depot in a cairn, put there by some of the other expedition team members who were growing worried about Mawson, Mertz, and Ninnis since they didn't get back when they were supposed to. But you know what? It was food. Mawson carried on, renewed, full of energy again. Almost a week and a half later, after battling more fierce winds, other maladies, and hunger, Mawson stumbled back into camp, half dead. He had missed the ship by a few hours. They got a wireless message out to the ship, because that was the technology that existed at that point, and the ship returned, but bad weather prevented it from docking to rescue Mawson, so he had to stay on in Antarctica for another winter. But at least he was alive, the only one of the three. On December 23rd, 1913, so almost a year later, he finally boarded a ship for Australia. He had spent all that extra time in the Antarctic collecting more geological and scientific data with the others who stayed at the base, and was about to bring back a wealth of new information, which is great because that was the point of his expedition. And in fact, so devoted as he was to science, they didn't even immediately sail for home. They rounded the coastline to get even more data. The ship finally returned to Australia on February 26th, and Mawson was given all kinds of praise and awards. He's a survivor of one of the harshest polar journeys I've ever read about, and a fitting hero for this age of Antarctic expeditions. So, why is it that names like Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen stand out amongst the polar explorers, but not Mawson? Well, David Roberts speculates in his book, Alone on the Ice, that, quote, since the second decade of the 20th century, Mawson has lurked in the shadow of his contemporaries Scott, Shackleton, and the great Norwegian polar explorer Roald Amundsen. The great reason for the neglect of Mawson and the Australasian Antarctic exploration lied in the fact that, unlike nearly all of the Antarctic explorers of what is called the heroic age, Mawson was completely uninterested in reaching the South Pole. What mattered to the man instead, and what drove the ambitions of his expedition, was the urge to explore lands that had never before been seen by human eyes, and to bring back from the southern continent the best science that men in the field might be capable of. End quote. It's a fair reasoning, I suppose. We often look at these explorers with the boldest claims, the biggest dreams, the competitive spirit. But Mawson, a man who pushed himself to the very edge of his limits and of our world, is a man who stands in line with the great polar adventurers of his time. And hey, you guys proud of me? No cannibalism today. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the deadly Antarctic explorations. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and join as a cannibal, an explorer, or a historian. If you want access to exclusive video content, you gotta be a cannibal or explorer. So if you want to support me or want extra stuff, check out my Patreon, and don't forget to subscribe to F Out on YouTube. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.